I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my past couple of weeks reading. First up is It's All Too Much by Peter Walsh. Peter Walsh was one of the hosts of the old TV series Clean Sweep. He was the Australian one. This is his guide to organization and cleaning. It's philosophically not super different from a lot of the popular ones that are around now, like the life-changing magic of tidying up. He just doesn't have that same anthropomorphizing of objects theme, so he's much more put it in a box and donate it, sell it, or throw it in the trash. It's very straightforward, so I don't have a lot to say about that one. Next up, I read Alamo Bankou's The Lights of Pointe-Noire. This is his memoir of after having spent a quarter of a century in France. He went back to Pointe-Noire in Congo and met up with family and friends. And this is told in a series of vignettes involving meeting up with people and meeting up with different places, and how people react to him and how he reacts to some of them, some of their memories. He presents a lot of pieces without a lot of context, and I know there are a lot of memoirs that are written by people who have been immigrants or expats or exiles who then go back to their home country. They often end up being part memoir and part history, and this is not that. This is very much a pure memoir. If you were reading this hoping to find out more history, there isn't a lot of that explicitly in here. Now, there are definitely undercurrents that talk about the post-colonial experience, and there are definitely things that have happened that are the result of economic and political happenings, but there isn't any explicit description of any of that. And there also isn't a lot of depth into his family history. There are bits that are mentioned, and he will often mention where in one of his novels he was inspired by a certain family member. So there's something of an expectation that you will have read his other work and be familiar with the idea that this person was the basis of that character. It's quite a short book, so there's not a lot to it, but I thought it was an interesting read because I don't think you see a lot of memoirs that are as stripped down as this was. This was very much, here is what happened, without a lot of explanation and without a lot of context, and I thought that was quite refreshing to read. Next up, I read a piece of theater writing, and that is Where the Blood Mixes by Kevin Loring. This is a fairly short play which won the Governor General's Award a few years ago. It looks at a community on a reserve in BC, and it is about 3 members of an older generation who are struggling quite a bit in life because of abuse that they suffered in residential schools, and as a result of that, the one man had his daughter taken away from him by social services a number of years before, and she as an adult is coming back to meet him. And it's basically a few days in the life of each of these characters. This is one of those plays that I think is much better to see a performance of than to read. However, I did really like in this that the author has a piece at the end where he talks about the development of it and how this started out as a one-man play, and that the actor who was working on it with him told him that he was frustrated with continuously playing this particular character. And I don't want to give too much away by sharing that, but I thought it was a really interesting way of working things through. And I thought the interaction between the author and that actor was an interesting look at generational differences in perception on issues. Simultaneously with that, I was listening to an audiobook of Orhan Pamuk's The Museum of Innocence, and this was read by John Lee. The Museum of Innocence is almost not a novel on its own, because Orhan Pamuk wrote this and started creating an actual museum simultaneously. So the book came out in, I believe, 2009, and the museum only opened, I think, in 2012, but they were being created at the same time. So I think it's almost difficult to talk about one or the other independently, because I don't think this is just a novel as a novel. The first thing that I would say about the book itself, though, is that it is basically 83 chapters in which only 3 of those chapters have actual action. The vast majority of this book is a man basically moaning to himself about how in love he is with this woman. Early on in the book, it's in the mid-70s in Istanbul. This man, Kamal, he has a fiancée who he quite likes, but he is also in love with his sort of distant cousin, but the point is made early on that it's a distant cousin by marriage, not by blood, who is 18 and he's 30. And they have a brief affair. His fiancée leaves him. This younger cousin marries someone else, and he very awkwardly is still in her life for years. And that is what most of this is. It is him moaning about how lovesick he is, even though he makes the point at one point that he's in love with his idea of this woman more than he's in love with the woman. And quite late in the story, the woman makes a point that both he and her husband are not really aware of what she wants. So on that level, it's almost gross. It's not a comfortable thing to read about this 30-year-old man who's obsessed with his 18-year-old cousin and then is at their house stealing things from her and her husband's house and sucking on them and weirdness. So it's almost distasteful that way. But just as much as that is the main point, sort of flowing alongside at the same time is basically a story about cultural and economic and to a certain extent political shifts in Istanbul in the 70s and 80s, and to a certain extent from the 50s to the 2000s. And the museum, the actual Museum of Innocence, is a collection of everyday items that presents that history of the neighborhood. And the descriptions of neighborhoods and neighborhood shifts and shops that become bakeries that become a shop and things like that. Shifting moral ideas and shifting attitudes and things like film are all really powerful in there, and that element I loved. So even though I thought the main obvious plot was incredibly distasteful, the kind of socio-cultural evolution that was being portrayed simultaneously I thought was brilliant. So it's a really interesting piece. I think it helps that Istanbul is one of my favorite cities to be walking around in. So even though sometimes there would be a description of this guy's obsession and I would think, ew, but then he would be walking past somewhere that I recognized, and I thought, well, that's interesting, so I kept reading. So yeah, I think this is definitely not something that is going to be for everyone, because the main plot is creepy, but it is really fascinating, and I think the fact that it was created together with this museum changes the emphasis there, because I would almost say that the cultural and the local flavor would almost be a secondary or tertiary element in any other book. But because you know that this is what that actual museum is about, it changes the focus in that, so it doesn't just exist as a novel on its own. It's part of this multimedia art installation, almost. Speaking of novels being more than just novels, the next thing that I read was The Hunting Accident, a true story of crime and poetry. This was written by David L. Carlson and drawn by Landis Blair. It is a really beautiful, has this really beautiful, very detailed black and white style. It's about a young man who's starting to get caught up in gangs, and at the point where he gets in trouble with the law, he has a conversation with his father where he finds out that his father was not blinded in a hunting accident, as he'd been told, but was blinded in a robbery, and that his father learned to read Braille in prison, and his father is a poet, and was taught to read Braille by a fairly famous thrill killer who was apparently known by their generation in Chicago. So it's this really fascinating story about learning and family secrets and what attitudes one might have towards criminals and different types of crime, and really interesting. I thought this was quite brilliant, both in terms of storytelling and in terms of art. But what I couldn't stand about this is how incredibly heavy it is. Now, I mean, this is a fairly long book. This is just under 500 pages, so this is a long book, but it is massively heavy and much heavier than it needs to be. It's not just a hardcover, but it's a bulky hardcover with very nice paper stock, but heavy paper stock, which I mentioned because I found that this book to be physically frustrating to read. So even though I thought the art and writing was brilliant, the fact that it was this huge and this heavy made it awkward. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll know I do most of my reading at the gym, and it was genuinely almost impossible to read this, for example, on a stationary bike. Now, I could fit it on the front of a treadmill, so that was fine. And also, if you're somebody who reads while commuting, this is incredibly awkward to add to a backpack or a laptop bag when you're on the subway, because this is not a book that's available in multiple formats yet. This is how it was released. And I think it's incredibly awkward to make it so that you are forced to read this in a particular setting almost, because it's so difficult to handle. Like, this is not a book you can hold in front of you. Like, I see a lot of people who read in the bath. This is not a book you could read in the bath. So if you saw me rate this on Goodreads, it lost a star just because it's so physically awkward. And that kind of connects to the last book, in that I think there was more to this than just the story. The publisher obviously made the decision to make this in that format, and I don't know if it's actually supposed to recall how incredibly heavy Braille books are. There is a point in there where the character in the framing device, the son, comments on carrying his dad's books home and how heavy Braille books are. So I don't know if it's supposed to recall that, but I did think it was an awkward size and an awkward weight, which I was frustrated with, even though I thought the book as a whole was brilliant. After that, I picked up another piece of nonfiction, and that is Churchill's Secret War, the British Empire and the Ravaging of India during the Second World War. This was written by Madhusree Mukerjee, and it is a look at the history of the famine in Bengal during, as it says, the Second World War. It makes the point that basically this was a colonial engineered famine where there was enough rice, there was enough wheat, and it just wasn't getting to the people because the British were, in a lot of cases, keeping it in storehouses so that it could be sent somewhere else, and it was just rotting there a lot of the time. And I think that's something that happened quite a bit during the colonial periods. And part of the point that is made is that a number of the people that were involved in the choices that made this famine happen wrote incredibly detailed memoirs or incredibly detailed histories of this period, and completely left out the number of deaths that they basically caused. Given the subject matter, I wouldn't call this particularly hard-hitting. It is a strangely easy read. This was quite quick to get through, and the numbers are horrifying, but the way it's written almost felt a little bit distanced, so I was surprised by that, because even though there are definitely stories in here where you're encouraged to think about the people, I was surprised at how non-personal it was, which I think is maybe intentional because the idea is to bring to light something that has really been ignored by a lot of history. This was definitely compelling and definitely interesting, but I was surprised by how distanced it felt and how quick it was to read. And finally, I listened to an audiobook of Colson Whitehead's Zone 1. This is read by Barresford Bennett. I've seen this described as being a literary zombie novel, which is not a bad description, to be honest. It is basically the main character musing about different points in his life. He is part of a crew that is removing straggling zombies from Manhattan, and he's originally from Long Island, and he flashes back and forth to different points in his life and to stories that people have told him. I found this incredibly compelling because I often read genre fiction. Like, the example that I thought of almost right away when I was about a quarter of the way through this was Superman Red Sun, which was Mark Millar's alternative universe Superman book that was about what if Superman had not landed from Krypton in the middle of the United States? What if he landed in the middle of the Soviet Union? And I loved the concept of that. But then it just went and became another action crossover. And I always felt that that didn't really take advantage of the really interesting setting. This is a book that actually does that, and it looks at the setting. So while there are some scenes that are somewhat action-y, this is never action-oriented or action-focused. This is very much a musing and pieces of memory and descriptions that are very prettily written and not focused on movement in the way that strict genre fiction tends to be. When I looked at some of the reviews on Goodreads, I saw that there were quite polarized opinions on this one, because I think a lot of the people who want to read these sort of memory musings in a non-linear story are not necessarily the same people who want to read about zombies rampaging through New York. And on the flip side, someone who's actually looking for a zombie action story doesn't want this non-linear musing, rambling type story. So while I loved this, I feel like there's a very specific audience for this, and it's not as broad as a general memory-focused, more literary book or a very zombies rampaging through New York action piece would be. But I thought this was extremely entertaining, and the narrator of the audiobook did the accents in a very nice way. He didn't go too over the top, which I think it would have been easy to do. So yeah, it was a good performance, and I really liked this. And I really wish there were more genre books that took that more meandering exploration of their world as opposed to the action focus or the quest focus that they usually do. So that was great. So yeah, that was my last couple of weeks. I hope you've had a good week. I'm a little behind on getting caught up with everybody's Friday reads, but hopefully I'll be getting to that as soon as I get this up. That's it for now. Ciao.